I remember the 1983 referendum campaign very well. It was a bitter, vicious campaign. And during the campaign, I held a public meeting in my local electoral area. There was no more than 10 people present, among them a future President of Ireland, Mary Robinson. Also Dr. Paddy Leahy, a GP in Ballyfermot, who was a fearless advocate of women's rights throughout the campaign. And also in attendance a Jewish doctor from Inchicore and a few women. I wondered, Chairman, if I held that meeting now in the aftermath of the tragedy in Galway, how many would attend? I believe the hall would be overflowing. Public opinion at that time was fixed firmly against the message we were trying to get across. The message that women's health in all its dimensions must be the overriding priority. Those of us who campaigned against the constitutional amendment were shunned by a large section of society, names read out from the pulpit by furious priests and bishops. They were slammed in our faces, etc. Since the early 1980s, the debate on legislating for abortion in certain circumstances has always been drawn straight to the extremes. As someone who favours the availability of abortion in limited circumstances, I would still consider myself pro-life. Killing babies is wrong. Let there be no doubt about that, despite some of the more extreme rhetoric on the anti-abortion side. That is not what this is about. This is about achieving a balance that gives due regard to the life, the health and the well-being of women. Difficult situations exist and arise, and doctors are regularly faced with difficult decisions where the life of the mother is in danger. It happens. And when it does, we must choose on the side of the woman's life. Doctors must be confident that they can make the right decision in the interests of women's health within a clear legal framework, free from the spectre of a 150-year-old piece of legislation that would have them treated as murderers. At the heart of the dilemma is the failure of the Constitution and the law to adequately express how to tackle these situations. As it stands, the legal position limits the choice which a doctor may have, and as a result endangers women. And this has been dramatically demonstrated by the case of Savita Halappanavar. While this tragic case is still under investigation, it seems to me that it was preventable. It should not have happened. An option that may well have saved her life was closed off to the doctors because of the legal uncertainty. To atone for this tragedy, we must act here in this Dáil and introduce the necessary and long overdue legislation. We need to make political decisions to minimise the risk. For too long, we have failed to remove the obstacles to protect women's safety during pregnancy and childbirth, the most vulnerable point on the planet, where there have been many, many more tragedies, many of which never reach the pages of the national newspapers because women's health has never been properly guaranteed. So we must act to remove the risk, remove the burden, remove the dread, and we must act now. Tragedies such as the recent one in Galway manifest themselves in various forms at various times. We cannot go back to the days of women being afraid to go to hospital for fear of their lives and instead being driven down the back streets into dark basements for illegal, unsafe abortions. The story of nurse Mamie Cadden, a nurse who performed abortions in Dublin in secret, in the face of the law, and was sentenced to death in 1956, is an example of the desperate choices women were forced to make. Nor can we continue to rely on an English solution to an Irish problem. Abortion is available to Irish women, at least those who can afford it in England. 4,000 young Irish women avail of this every year, and this is not acceptable. These women are forced to travel, often alone, without any support, and on their return they feel they must hide their shameful secret. They endure an emotional ordeal, the like of which I can only imagine, without access to psychiatric support, etc., that they need. Any framework that forces women into this position is wrong. If a woman finds herself in a position where she feels she has no option but to terminate her pregnancy, she must have access to support and not be cast out on her own. The 1983 amendment is a cul-de-sac that we have pushed women's lives into. And we sent them into this cul-de-sac at the most critical time in their lives. The 1983 amendment was for the pro-life movement the solution to any future challenge. It put two lives, the life of the mother and the life of the unborn child, on an equal footing. But instead of answering any future questions, this measure has made these questions more difficult to answer. While the idea of another referendum on abortion has to date been propagated only by the pro-life side, I too believe that such an initiative may well be needed to provide further clarity. The campaign for reproductive rights and for women's rights is not a new one. It didn't start last month, last year, or even 20 years ago. A clear legal framework in which pregnancies can be legally terminated has been a political imperative for over 30 years, but successive governments have failed to act, failed and failed again. I have great admiration for the work of Jim Kemmy. 30 years ago, at the helm of the Democratic Socialist Party, he charted a practical and courageous course. The Democratic Socialist Party was a relatively small party, but size didn't limit its vision on abortion, on Northern Ireland, on Europe, on workers' rights, on the patronage of schools, and many, many more subjects, topics, and issues. The course it laid out on abortion was not a popular course at the time, but you have to admire the courage and foresight that Jim Kemmy and the DSP demonstrated. At that time, one church set the moral parameters of political discourse, and no established party was prepared to take it on. The orthodoxy at the time was that women have to take their chances, take their lives into their own hands. Jim Kemmy publicly challenged this orthodoxy and indeed our entire political culture, and he paid a political price for that. The position that Jim Kemmy outlined and defended in the face of widespread opposition would have prevented many of the terrible, gruesome situations which have arisen over the past 30 years. He firmly believed that an absolute prohibition on abortion could not be justified, as it may be necessary in certain limited circumstances. Had his course of action been followed, X would not have needed to go to the Supreme Court in such tragic circumstances. 20 years later, C would not have needed to go to the European Court of Human Rights. Although all the facts are not yet clear, I believe that had Kemmy's course been followed in 1983, the circumstances of the tragic death of Savita Halappanavar may never have arisen. The following is an extract from the Democratic Socialist Party Outline Policy on Women's Rights, first published in 1982, and I'll just quote a short piece. The woman who finds herself with an unwanted pregnancy is presented with a catch-22 situation. Does she hide herself in a maternity hostel for 6 months, in the process losing her job or missing essential schooling? Does she face the social ostracization of neighbours and workmates for 9 months and then go through the trauma of adoption? Does she try to keep her child and spend many years in a desperate economic struggle, all the time apologising for her child's existence? Or does she take the boat to England and have an abortion? Many of these women are pregnant as a result of inadequacy of contraceptive facilities here. Many are extremely young and pregnant through ignorance due to the lack of adequate sex education. Some are pregnant as a result of rape. Under Irish law, they are criminals if they opt for abortion. The morality which says to these women and girls that they must suffer the consequences, and which at the same time ostracizes the unmarried or wounded woman who is pregnant, must be exposed for the hypocrisy of that it is. The DSP, while opposed to indiscriminate abortion, would consider it as a solution in 3 specific instances. 1, where a woman's life is endangered by pregnancy. 2, where pregnancy has resulted from rape or incest. And 3, to the terrible problems of congenital abnormality of the fetus, which makes survival outside the womb impossible. The DSP confirms its view that this is a perfectly moral position to uphold in a pluralistic Irish society. End of quote from that document. This policy, considered barbaric by so many when it was first outlined in 1982, now, 30 years later, appears so reasonable, so sensible to the vast majority of Irish public opinion. A generation later, our political culture has broadened and finally caught up. And as we move forward, can I suggest that this framework may well be the best guide? This sensible moral position cost Jim Kemmy his seat in Dáil Éireann in 1982. During this campaign, he was denounced from the pulpit and pilloried in his local press. The Limerick leader, and I quote, wrote, "Abortionist Jim Kemmy is hitting below the belt." They wrote, "Let the people decide which is the better way, the pro-life way or Kemmy's way of death." End of quote. His brave and prescient position was exploited by his political opponents and his seat was lost. This was the price he paid for his foresight and for his commitment to women's rights. I am very happy that 30 years later, public opinion has shifted so far towards what Kemmy believed. I only hope now that the members of this House honour his memory by doing the right thing and not shirking their responsibilities as legislators, and take the long overdue steps that are needed to protect women's lives. Thank you.